Well, thank you for joining me for our study in the last portion of Deuteronomy. Here at the Farwell Church of Christ through 2020, we are striving to read through the entire Bible cover to cover. And over the course of this last week, if you've been working on that with us, you have read Deuteronomy chapters 17 through 34. Before we get any further this morning, I want you to make sure that you've got three things available to you. First and most importantly is a Bible. It can be a print Bible, it can be on your phone, but make sure you have that Bible open to Deuteronomy chapter 30. Secondly, if you're a note taker, have your notebook, have a pen or a pencil in front of you. There are some things that are going to appear on the screen through the course of our study today that you're going to want to write down. Thirdly, and least importantly, if you happen to have a map of Israel during the time of the Exodus, have that sitting on the table in front of you as well. There may be very well maybe one in the back of your Bible for you to look at also. But make sure you have those three things. Pause the video, go get them, come back, and then restart the video so that we can continue the study together. Well, now that you've gathered those three things, make sure that Bible is open to Deuteronomy chapter 30. And some of you are going to help me with this study this morning with doing a little reading in that as we go. Back when I was in middle school, my dad came to me with a challenge one summer. And that challenge was this: memorize all 50 states in alphabetical order. And if I did that, he was going to give me $50. If I chose not to do it, I got nothing. It's a really simple concept, isn't it? If I met Dad's expectation, I would get a blessing. I would get a reward. But if I failed to meet his expectation, I would get nothing. No blessing, no reward. But the choice was mine. I had to decide, was I going to memorize all 50 states in alphabetical order, or was I going to do something else with my summer? We all face choices in life. Some of them are very simple things that we do every day, and we may not even really give a lot of thought to it. Like, what am I going to wear today? Or maybe you're thinking something like, should I clean the garage while I'm self-quarantined? Those are not major life decisions, but we make those kinds of decisions every single day. And then there are times where we are incredibly aware of the fact that some of the choices we face are going to have some significant consequences. The decision that we make is going to have a long-lasting impact on our lives. Things like, should I go to college or not? And if I decide to go to college, which college is going to give me the best education possible? Or which one's going to give me the most financial aid? Other major life decisions are choosing a career. If I do this, then I'm not able to do that, but I really enjoy it, but not. And choosing a career can be difficult. Maybe another major life decision would be, do we buy a house or do we rent? Another one would be, do I get married or do I stay single? If I'm going to get married, is it going to be to this person or this person or this person? And then there are other times in our lives when we make a decision and we're entirely ignorant. That's not wrong, but we just don't know what the potential consequences may be. There are times when we face big decisions and we just don't stop and think about the consequences to those decisions. And it's only later in life that we realize the impact those decisions have had on our lives. But let's realize that every single decision we make, all of our decisions have consequences. And some of those consequences are incredibly serious. Moses is going to point that out to the Israelites as he wraps up his final teaching to them prior to his death. My prayer for you is that as we go through this study, that you would be challenged to think about the choices that you make and how they reflect your faith to the world around you, but most importantly, What do they communicate to God about what you believe and whether or not you trust him? That's what I want you to think about this morning. I hope that you will be prompted to think about the choices that you face in terms of what your faith is. Now, I want you to find that map. It should look something like this one. I want you to find the Dead Sea, and I want you to find the city of Jericho that should be just to the north of the Dead Sea and a little bit to the west. Find that city of Jericho. And then draw a little bit of a line, probably an imaginary line, across to the east, across the Jordan River a little ways. And once you have your finger in that spot, you're in about the same location as where the nation of Israel was camped at the time that Moses gave this speech to the nation of Israel. They were preparing to enter the land that God had promised them. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, what we have is Moses' retelling of the history of Israel. This is the first generation of people to have lived entirely outside the country of Egypt. They didn't know from personal experience the slavery that their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents had experienced. They had heard about God's laws, and here what Moses is going to be doing through the book of Deuteronomy is he's retelling those laws to remind them of God's expectation of his people. The first half of Deuteronomy, approximately, is Moses focusing on 4 major ideas. The first one is he tells them time and time again to remember what God had done for them. The second thing he encouraged them to do is to obey God's law. Over and over again, he says, you need to be obedient, be obedient, be obedient to God's law. The third thing he reminded them to do was to love God, because loving God encourages us to be obedient. And fourthly, he encouraged them to teach these things, what God had done for them, what God's law was, and to love God. Teach those things to your future generations. Moses had seen a pattern play out over his lifetime. He'd seen it time and time again. And we've talked about this in our study through the course of the last several months. He gave the idea of order. And he says, God established an order. That is God's law. God set this order up in order to make sure that his people lived according to his expectations. The problem is that many people in the nation of Israel and people around the world had decided to reject God's law, and they ended up living in sin. Because of sin, God had to place judgment upon the people. There's the consequences for rejecting God's law. And in all of that, there were times where we certainly see that God, even though he judges and places consequences on humanity for their sin, he also extends grace time and time again. If you need to, take a few minutes and write that down. Order, sin, judgment, and grace. Pause the video for a minute, write that down, and then because we're going to be using it through the course of the sermon. Now, here's the point where you're going to help. I'm going to ask you here in a second to pause the video and have someone in the room, maybe if you're all by yourself, that's going to have to be you, but I'd encourage you to even read it out loud. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 14. Let me say that again. I want you to read Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 14. And when you've read those verses, then restart the video. Now I want you to let those verses soak in. Really stop and think about what Moses has just said. Obedience to God's order is not a lost cause. Did you catch that? If we think about God's order, sometimes we might think that God's expectations are way too high. But instead, Moses says that obedience to God's order is not an exercise in futility. It's not impossible. Now, let me be clear, because the Bible is very clear that for us to obey God's law perfectly without ever making a mistake is beyond our ability. We are going to mess up. We will make mistakes from time to time. That's not Moses' point to say that we'll be able to obey God's order perfectly, but that obedience in general is possible. Moses' point in those 4 verses that you just read was that God is not preventing us from being obedient by keeping his expectations secret from us. He's not making us play a guessing game about what he really wants from us. Understand that was significantly different from the pagan religions that were scattered around the ancient world, from those that were in Egypt that the people had heard of, from those that were in Canaan where they were about to go. Those ancient pagan religions taught that as humanity, we had to be at the mercy of their gods. We had to guess what the deities that ruled over us wanted. And humanity was playing this constant guessing game about, does the God want this? Does it want this? Does it want this? And Moses is pointing out to the Israelites that Yahweh is different. In fact, Yahweh had done something so incredible by revealing his will to humanity, and he had done it so that we could obey it. It wasn't a guessing game. It wasn't a mystery. It wasn't a secret. In fact, God had done something very special for humanity. Now I'm going to ask you again to pause the video and have someone else now in the room read Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 through 20. Deuteronomy 30, 15 through 20. And when you've read that, restart the video. As Moses is nearing the end of this last teaching of his, he points out to the Israelites that everything he's told them comes down to this one choice. Life and prosperity, he says, or death and destruction. It helps me to think of it kind of like a flow chart. And I'm going to put one up here on the screen for you, I hope. If you need to, pause the video and draw that flow chart down. Now, I want to point out chapter 30, verse 16 specifically. Listen to Moses' choice that he says it belongs to all of the Israelites, and to you and me ultimately as well. Chapter 30, verse 16. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Did you catch that? Obedience is not about trying to change the way that I behave. Instead, Moses says that the foundation of obedience is love. If we want to obey God, the place where we have to start is with loving God. Because when we really love someone, we're actually going to want to do what pleases them. The same thing is true here, Moses says. If we truly love God, then we are going to want to obey God. He goes on and he says, but when our hearts are not devoted to God, when we love anything else more than God, what we end up doing is we end up causing some consequences for ourselves that Moses did not want to have happen for the nation of Israel. The result was going to be curse. It was going to be destruction. It was going to be death. And for the Israelites specifically, Moses offered a really striking warning. He declared that the Jewish nation would be destroyed. That's a really serious matter. Over 500 years earlier, God had covenanted, that's an easy word to say. He'd made a really serious promise, like a contract, with Abram, who we now call Abraham. And he had said, Abraham, I'm going to turn you into a great nation. I'm going to give you land. And here, as Moses is speaking, Israel had become that great nation that God had promised to Abraham. And just as they are about to get the land that they could see it across the Jordan River, Moses says, if you don't obey God, you're going to lose not only that land, but your status as a nation as well. You could lose absolutely everything that God desires for you, Moses told him. If Israel was disobedient, if Israel turned away from God, if their loyalty shifted to anything other than Yahweh God, destruction was in their future. The choice was theirs. They could choose to stay in this land that they already knew was abundant with crops and livestock. Or they could face destruction and they could face exile. Moses says, you can choose life or death. You can choose blessing or curse. But Israel, each and every one of you has to make the decision for yourself. Every individual in that nation had to decide for themselves how they were going to respond to God's order. It was not just going to be their leaders saying, we'll obey God. It was every single person. Reading Moses' words here, I imagine him pleading with the nation of Israel to choose life, choose prosperity, choose blessing. And not just for yourselves, but choose it for your future generations because it's about them as well. After Moses concludes his speech, he appoints his right-hand man, Joshua, to take over as the leader of Israel after Moses dies. Moses then looks at the people of Israel and he prophesied. And I can't help but wonder if it's based on his personal experience with them over the course of the past 40 years. But he tells them that eventually they're going to stop teaching future generations about God. They're going to stop telling future generations about what God has done for them. They're going to stop telling future generations about the importance of loving God. And instead, what they're going to do is they're going to completely forget about Yahweh God. They're going to forget to pay attention to the law and God's order, and they're going to slip into disobedience. And in fact, what they're going to do, Moses says, is they are going to end up choosing death and curse. They are going to choose sin and judgment over God's order. They're going to choose disobedience over obedience. If you need to, I want you to pause and write that down again. Order, sin, judgment, grace. And as he wraps up his speech, Moses points out that even though he predicts their disobedience and future consequences, he says 3 times that grace is going to exist even in the midst of that judgment. The book of Deuteronomy closes on a cliffhanger. Moses climbs up a mountain and dies. Joshua takes the lead of the nation. The writer of Deuteronomy says that there was nobody like Moses. And we are left wondering, what will Israel choose? Now, I want to point out that Israel's choice, the choice between life and death, prosperity and destruction, blessing and curse, that choice is your choice. That choice is my choice. And it's not a one-time thing. It's not a decision that we can make today and then we're good for the rest of our lives. In fact, there are days we are going to face that same decision many times in that 24-hour period. That choice is yours, life or death, blessing or curse. Which one are you going to choose today? Jesus taught us that there were two important commandments that ranked above all the others. The first was to love God with every fiber of our being, and the second was like it, to love our neighbors as ourselves. He taught us to be generous with our material possessions. He taught us to help those who have physical and spiritual needs. And like Moses, Jesus also taught us to teach these things to future generations. What are you going to choose? Now, it doesn't mean that you have not obeyed God's commandments in the past. Please understand that it does mean that this week you can obey better than you did last week. Do you hear the difference there? And I realize that you and I are doing this thing called a virtual church service because of coronavirus. It has really changed our lives very quickly. But coronavirus has not changed the choice that you and I face today. To be obedient to God or to be disobedient to God. To choose life or to choose death. To choose blessing or curse. That choice continues to remain. And so I am going to give you a homework assignment. It's actually 3 parts. So you're going to want to grab that notebook. You're going to want to grab that pencil and pen. You're going to want to write these down. And I'd encourage you to put it someplace where you can see it. Use it through the course of the week. If you've got little ones at home, if you talk to others about it this week. If you need to, pause this video in order to write these 3 things down. Number 1, I encourage you to obey God better this week than last week. We all have room for improvement. And so our goal is to just make an improvement. Obey him better this week than we did last week. And I don't know exactly what that's going to look like for you. Honestly, I don't even know what that necessarily looks like for me because I don't know what this week holds. So I'm going to offer you some suggestions. Some may apply to you, some may not. Some may spur another idea. And if you need to, stop the video, write down ideas as you have them. Kids, try obeying your parents better this week. And I realize that, man, we're all stuck at home and there's no school. And so, kids, there's probably room for you to improve this week in obeying your parents. Because we are told in Scripture that as you obey your parents, you are obeying and honoring God. And kids, while you're around home, maybe you work on serving a little bit better. Maybe there's some chores around the house that you know that need to get done. Go ahead and do those. Help out with mom and dad because they've got a lot on their plates too. Adults, I'd encourage you to maybe look around the house and look at the material possessions that you have and say, do I have more than I need here? And to share what God has given you with others who are in need. Maybe what it means in your house is to spend some time talking with the kids about things that God has taught you. Maybe you take this topic of the choice that we all face and sit down at dinner time and talk with the kids and do an accountability check with each other. Are you obeying God better this next week than you did last week? For all of us, I am certain we could probably all complain a little bit less this week than we did last week. Whether it's verbally, whether it's on social media, we can probably be more positive about the circumstances we're living in. And by doing that, we can offer people a sense of hope, a sense of love, a sense of peace. Maybe this video, you've been watching it and you're thinking, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe that Jesus has died for my sins, but I've never taken that step of being baptized into Christ. And you're ready to submit your life to his authority. If that's you, normally I'd say talk to me after the service, but if that's you right now, maybe you need to give me a call at the office. Maybe you need to send me an email, and we can set up a time to get together and we can talk by phone, maybe by video. But just because of social distancing doesn't mean that you cannot make a decision on behalf of Jesus Christ this week. The second part of your homework this week is, what do you need to do to love God more? Now, again, that's the foundation of obedience, right? So how do you love God more this week than you did last week? One suggestion is actually part 3 of your homework, and that is to do the weekly Bible readings. You can find a copy of the Bible reading plan on the website, or I will attach a link to it below in the description. Maybe what you need to do this week in order to love God more is to pay less attention to the messages of fear that are out there in our culture right now. Maybe what you need to do instead is listen to the messages of hope, the messages of life and blessing, in order to be able to have a positive, godly attitude in this very challenging time. Again, I want to remind you that God has not changed just because of coronavirus. In fact, the hope and the love that come from a relationship with Jesus Christ are maybe even more important during these times than they were just a week ago. Another thing you can do to love God more, I'd encourage you to listen to Christian music. Turn on one of those Christian radio stations, or if you download a lot of music, get online and download some of your favorite Christian songs. And then listen to that message of hope and that message of celebration that comes from having a relationship with God. Especially in some of your now downtime, because life has changed so much, as you're sitting at home and wondering, maybe, what do I do? If you have a favorite Bible verse, sit down and turn that into a work of art. It may be with crayons, it may be with markers or colored pencils. It doesn't have to be fancy. Maybe you've got some paints. Dig something out and make a work of art that reminds you of the message of Scripture, and put that up and display it in your house. Even though coronavirus has made life different for us, please realize that it is temporary. Life is only different for the moment. And coronavirus has not changed Jesus' commands to his followers. Now, how we obey those commands might look a little bit different because life has changed, but the choice itself remains. Life or death, blessing or curse. And I bet in the last few minutes it hasn't been difficult for you to realize which one of those the media in our country has chosen. But the media is not you. So my question to you is the same question that Moses asked the Israelites. What are you going to choose? Life or death? Blessing or curse? That's your choice this week. I've moved to our church's kitchen in order to be able to take communion with you. In the book of Matthew, Jesus is speaking to his disciples the night before he was crucified. And it says in Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and When he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." If you have some bread, I have a little piece of bread there, and you have some grape juice, I would invite you to take some time to join me in taking communion. Jesus explains that his body was going to be broken on the cross for us. He said his blood was going to be shed for us for the forgiveness of sins. And so this morning, as you get ready to take communion with me, I would invite you to think about that choice that I just talked about. That choice between life and death and blessing and curse. You see, Jesus, he made a choice to be obedient to God that included a physical death, but so that you and I could have a spiritual life with him. Later in Scripture, we are told that when we take the emblems, the bread and the juice, and we eat and we drink, that we do it not only to remember Jesus, but to declare to the world our loyalty to him. And maybe this morning you've just said, I need to do that. Then join us. This is a witness to the world that we are Jesus' followers, that we eat of bread without yeast, that we drink grape juice, and you don't have to have little teeny fancy cups like these. The serving size doesn't matter. The purpose behind it, the choice that we make when we eat and when we drink, is to remember Jesus, to remember the sacrifice that he made, the choice he made, so that you and I could have life. So again, the choice you need to make today, the choice you need to make this week. How are you going to love God more? He loved us to the point of death. How are you going to obey God better this week? He obeyed to the point of death. Have a great week. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you want to talk to me about the things that you've read this last week in Deuteronomy, by all means, shoot me an email, send me a text, give me a call. I will be happy to hear from you, and I look forward to seeing you again.